In this video, I have some tips for solving the first 8 edges on your 5x5. So this first tip relates to finishing off the last 2 centers. I do see some people do something like this, where they do, for example, here I'm finishing off this white center on the front, RU prime, and then rotate, and then start pairing up their edges and keeping this slice unsolved. So in my opinion, keeping this slice unsolved actually creates an unnecessary restriction when you start edges, and it only takes 0.1 seconds to actually turn this back, particularly if you're quite a fast turner. And the unnecessary restriction that it creates is that you have to, or you're forced to start your edge pairing on this slice, and particularly if you solve on the E slice, it means you have to do a Z rotation and then start pairing from there. Whereas, for example, in this case, if we just do a RU prime R prime, literally the R prime is no extra work, and then we have a lot more flexibility in terms of where we can start our first edges. So for example, here we've got this block and this one here. If we were to do RU prime, these two would end up on opposite sides, so that one would end up there and that one would end up there. However, if we do RU prime R prime, then we have quite an easy case where we can just rotate this way and start our edge pairing here, or we can bring them into the front face and start our edge pairing around this slice. And something I quite often like to do is just do that and then not rotate at all and start my edge pairing around this E slice like that. The only general situations in which I wouldn't slice back is if I have something like this, so RU prime, and then if slicing back actually destroys this block or destroys this block, so here we have this block, RU prime, and then we could rotate and start solving this last blue and red edge. Or if we had something like this, so RU prime, the U prime brings this into the front, we don't want to undo that. So then in those sorts of cases, then I would rotate and not do the last slice move. But for everything else, I prefer to do the last slice move and have a lot more flexibility with regards to where I start my edge pairing. So a key part of edge pairing is being efficient and avoiding too many moves. Obviously, I mentioned this in the intermediate tutorial, but once you pair up an edge, so let's say we're doing the white and red one, we don't want to just take it out into the top layer and replace it with anything. We want to take it out in a productive manner. So here we've got this white and red, and we want to solve this green and yellow one next, and the last wing here is up here, the midge is here, and the other wing is here. So instead of just going RU, R prime, or or rotating the top layer and just taking out a random edge, we would look to actually just insert this one in the same moment as we take out this one, right? And the same thing goes for the rest of the edges. So here, let's say, was not very much available to us. Let's say we want to start working on these yellow and blues, then we would go RU prime, R prime, work on those, etc. And then let's say we want to work on these yellow and orange. These two are connected and the midge is over here. So we could go RU, R prime. And that's something that I saw when I was pairing this one up. I saw that this yellow and orange one went to the back here. And instead of doing a U2 and then inserting it, we can just go RU, R prime straight away and pair up the next one, and then so on and so forth. So when you take out this edge, you want to be taking it out in a productive manner, not just inserting some random edge and then going to the next one. So I talk about this sort of technique in the intermediate module, but it's basically making a decision about where to store your edges. So obviously, if you store all 4 edges on one layer, or if you get 4 edges stored on one layer, then you no longer need to access that layer, and you can keep it on the bottom and solve your remaining edges just using the top layer and the edges around the middle layer, which is obviously very fast and pretty good for look ahead. So if we have a situation like this, then obviously there's a decision that you need to make. So if we've solved 3 edges into this bottom layer and only 1 into the top layer, then it probably makes more sense to actually store this one in the bottom layer and then continue working, rather than trying to continue looking ahead. And this is where there's some trade-offs involved. So we need to think about, okay, what's the best way to put this into the bottom layer? Should we just insert it? Should we look at this edge and see if it can be useful to us? Or should we just put it in the bottom layer and then try and look ahead after that? My inclination is really just to put it in the bottom layer. So D prime, R prime, D, R, like that, and then continue. And actually when we did that, these green and white ones worked out quite nicely for us. And yeah, looking ahead around the top layer, particularly after we've solved 4 edges, looking ahead around the top and middle layers should be fairly straightforward and a lot easier than solving our first 4 edges. Another thing to practice in your edge pairing is using wide moves with 3 layers. So for example here, we've got this one and these two which need to be paired up, and we've also got these two at the back here. instead of doing U move there and then a rotation, what we can do is actually do 3D wide, like that, and then insert this one like that. And even after that, we can, instead of doing a U and then rotating, so say we want to do these ones next, instead of doing a U and then rotating, we can do a wide D move like that. And I tend to do them with my thumb, like so. And we can insert those like so. The last midge is here. So a quick example of somewhere where we might use this, and there are many cases and it's a very flexible technique, but if we have a case like this where we've got this midge here and these two wings like this, we would go RU, R prime, U prime, put these in the back right slot, then when we do an RU prime, R prime, we can do the U, 3U wide to actually place it in this front right slot and continue working on our edges. Another thing that's important to work on is inserting unsolved pairs or pieces into the back right slot, and if you're a left-hander, on the back left slot. So let's say we have a case like this where these three are solved and we want to solve these ones. We could obviously do a U prime and then F, R prime, F prime, R, and then do a U2 to put these in the back left. Or we could do something like this. So rotate R prime, U prime, R, which inserts this, this edge piece here, this wing, to this position, and then do a U2, and now we can work with this in the front and take it out how we like. One mental technique that I've kind of been trying to train and think about in my solves is to put bad look ahead and pauses behind me. So let's say I take quite a while to pair up an edge, then I shouldn't let something that's in the past kind of demotivate me and mess up the rest of my solve. So whenever something like that happens, I kind of train my brain to like flick a switch and completely forget about it and just continue with the rest of the solve and try and get back into flow in my edges. Flow during the edges is pretty important. Sometimes being actually spammy and a little bit inefficient can keep up your flow during the solve. Rather than, if we're in a case like this and we see we've got this one and we've got these three edges all in front of us, easily visible, and they're pretty easy to insert, then sometimes just doing this and spamming and doing the fast moves is actually beneficial for our flow, rather than taking too much time to actually look around and try and evaluate, okay, like we might not have seen this was a really easy insert with just a wide U. So sometimes instead of just doing that, instead of looking around the cube and pausing a little bit to look for the most efficient option, it can be beneficial to, if you want to keep up the flow during a solve, to just do it like that. And while we're doing that, we might notice that we've got this easy case for the next edge, something like that. This sort of thing is particularly important for the first few edges because there's so many different options all around the cube that it's impossible to properly evaluate all of them. So if you do see some edges, in the front and left and right slots, then I would go ahead and just solve those straight away and try and get into the groove of the solve. By now you should be pretty decent at looking ahead and pretty efficient in your solves, so that means avoiding doing flipping algorithms where it's practical. Obviously in some cases doing flipping algorithms to solve an edge is easy and, like I said before, continues your flow. One positive about doing a flipping algorithm is it means that you'll have a little bit of time to look ahead and plan your next pair because you're just doing 7 moves that where you don't really need to think. Obviously you should never ever use more than one flipping algorithm to solve a tredge. That's just a hard rule that you should definitely follow. Again, this one's a little bit more of a mental tip, but once you start solving an edge, kind of commit to it and make sure you finish it. So if you've already started and paired up 2 pieces of a full tredge, don't give up on it and move to something else. So even if it's quite hard to find the last piece, the last blue and yellow piece, make sure you just be methodical and calm about searching for it. Sometimes people do have these big pauses in the solve where they're looking for one edge, but make sure, don't just, if you can't find it, don't just give up on it and change to something new. Force yourself to find the last piece no matter like how long it takes. This is just a good practice thing. So let's find this one. Okay, it's on the top. It ended up being back here. And sometimes, you might find that, the edge is actually staring you right in the face and you didn't really look at it too closely, but that's the sort of thing that happens. And those pauses will get smaller with time. Another nice little algorithm. So if we've got these two here, we want to flip this one. Instead of flipping this and then doing a U2, we can actually move this from the back to the front. Make sure that you have an unsolved edge in the back, the top back position there. So you can do R prime, U, R2, U prime, R prime. So that brings this edge from the back to the front and flips it. And then we can go on. Even more efficient than that, and this is something that's really, really hard to implement. Personally, I don't do this in solves, but if your look ahead is really solid, maybe worth experimenting with. So let's say we've got the same case with these two here, and this one's on the back right, and we would need to flip it and pair it up with these two. If our centers are symmetrical along this E slice, so the same two colors are on this top and bottom position, we can actually just do an R2. And notice that when we do an R2, these two just swap, but they're the same color, so it doesn't really matter. So doing the R2 moves this here, and we can continue with our edge pairing and pair this one up. As you get faster and your edge pairing becomes more subconscious, you should also try and keep mental notes of where you've stored edges. So let's say we've solved this one, we store this one on the top, and for some reason we need to do a Z2 to flip and continue on the next side. Then obviously we need to just keep in mind that we've solved 2 on the bottom, and as we're solving these ones, if there's an opportunity to flip, then we might prefer to do that to try and get 4 edges stored on the bottom here. So don't go too far out of your way to do that, but just keep it in mind as you're solving the edges. A couple of common sense / intuitive things. Obviously, you should be color neutral for solving your edges in order to take advantage of easy cases, and you should avoid doing too many Z2s. So you should definitely you should not need to do 2 Z2 rotations to solve one edge. And sometimes it's actually beneficial to do X2 rotations like that if you have things that you need to work on the back side here. You shouldn't be too afraid of them, but again, it's preferable that you avoid them where possible. Another technique you can sometimes use, and this might be a little bit intuitive, but it's being able to recognize an edge piece, so an entire edge piece based on just one sticker. So here's what I mean. So let's say we want to solve this yellow and orange edge piece, and looking around the cube, we only see one yellow sticker back here, and as it so happens, we've actually solved 3 of our yellow edge pieces already on the bottom layer. Now, I don't really keep in my mind, exactly the colors of the edge pieces that I've already solved, but it's a pretty clear indication that this one is going to be our last yellow edge piece, because I don't see any other yellow stickers around the entire cube. And yeah, as it happens, we've solved the first 3 yellow ones here. So instead of doing a U2 and verifying that this is in fact the yellow and orange, based on what we know, we can deduce that this is the yellow and orange piece and go straight away and solve that pair. So this next tip is about as complicated as I'll get during my 5x5 edge pairing, and it's basically just preserving blocks of pieces like this. So let's say we have 2 blocks of pieces like this. What I'll actually do is preserve them or place them parallel to one another so that the wings line up and these midges line up, instead of doing R, U prime, R prime. And this is because I was able to see that the other 2 wings were over here. So I can easily do F, R prime, F prime, R, like that, and then insert this one into the back, and then do a D prime. So solving this edge whilst preserving this one. And yeah, like I said, you don't want to be keeping track of too much in your mind when you're solving 5x5 edges, and that's about the limit for me. Because you preserved this block while you were solving this pair, then solving the next one, so attaching this wing to it, is very, very straightforward. Another semi-fancy technique, which involves kind of keeping track of 2 edge pairs, is flipping multiple things at once. So normally, if we were to solve these 2, if we wanted to flip these 2, we would do something like a U, flip it, and then a U prime, like that. But instead of doing that, if we notice that we also have this flipped wing, so this one belongs down here, then we can do a U prime, flip both of these, and then when we do a U slice back, we can also do a D slice back and solve these 2. Not that we would necessarily do that, but it's just something to keep in mind that we can flip multiple pieces at once rather than just flipping one piece to our advantage.